Hello, everyone. I'm really glad to be with you again in a new episode of The Fact, the series that discuss international political issues every week. We have two respected guests today that would like to talk about the subject of Iraq and recent events that has been going on in this country. We have from California, Dr. Alexander Azadgan, a professor of international political economy and senior editor with United World International Analytical Center. And also from Canada, Mr. Khaled Al-Kassimi, international relations doctoral candidate and political analyst who are actually accepting our invitation to the program. I would like to welcome both of you to this episode. And I will go straight to the first question, which is basically the initial and the main reason behind this protests in Iraq. Mr. Azadgan, could you please give us a bit of explanation about the possible and definite reasons behind this event?
Yes, thank you for having me, Ali. It's always good to be with your program. Before we answer that question, we have to lay down some facts which will help us understand what is going on in Iraq in conjunction with your question. First of all, Iraq is ranked number 168 out of 180 countries when it comes to corruption, according to the Transparency International Corruption Index. The economic mismanagement and missed opportunities have led to widespread unemployment. The country also has widespread water crisis. It has an electricity crisis. In Iraq, we have a system failure in providing governance, especially jobs for youth. 60% of Iraqi youth are below the age of 24. It's one of the youngest countries in the world. The identity politics that permeates throughout the system, whereby Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds find representation and form big tent camps, and governments in the absence of an opposition has failed in translating that representational system into roads, hospitals, schools, and most importantly, jobs for that younger demographic. That is why the protests are so massive on one hand, but also the anger is targeted at not a particular group or sect or party, but at the entirety of the system. Well, to be fair, as of recently, the Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, who resigned recently, his government was a capable government, but it had inherited long-lasting structural problems. Whether they are going to implement some of those deep reforms that the public demands, or perhaps if they fail, the new government, if they fail at those reforms and economic and political, then perhaps these protests would escalate into demanding a change in the entire political system itself, which is what Washington wants around the world. Washington, as you know, is addicted to regime change. There's really no strong central leadership. The situation is really grim. There's no way into coming into grips. I don't know how any government in Iraq right now would be able to deal with the necessities that are being demanded by the protesters in terms of jobs, food, water, or electricity. To wrap this up, the problem, in my opinion, Ali, is systematic, it's structural, and it's massive, and I fear it's going to get a whole lot worse in the months to come. Maybe not a continuation of what's going on right now, but perhaps sporadically with a break or two in the middle. These problems are not confined to a single government. They span across several administrations. It's the entire system that's dysfunctional. The Iraqi sectarianism is also destroying the country. Around 800 to 900 billion dollars were actually stolen during the past 16 years. We should talk about that. We cannot just put all the blame on the foreigners. Also, there's no solid national Iraqi identity like there used to be. There's Shia, Kurds, Sunni, Yazidis, etc., and etc. But there's no collective identity. This is the biggest problem that's facing the Iraqi elites and also the Iraqi people. The Iraqi revenue per month from oil revenue is $6 billion. where is this money being spent and who's stealing most of it? This is what we need to focus on when we are focusing on Iraq, as well as the external, extra regional, as well as regional countries that are interfering in Iraq. And by that, I'm talking specifically about Saudi Arabia and UAE, in addition to Turkey in northern Iraq.
Doctor, you pointed out different points about the sectarianism in Iraq and the system, the structure of Iraq. So I would like to go into this question, asking from Mr. Al-Kassimi about this political system that is existing in Iraq. As you know, this system is based on diversity of ethnicity and sects. And I would like to know if this kind of political system and this kind of diversity would cause such corruptions or inefficiency in the country or not.
Thanks for having me, and good evening to both of you gentlemen. I think as Dr. Azadgan was saying, we need to go back to what happened after the conquest of Iraq in 2003, and the specific period that I think would allow us to dissect your question. And as Dr. Azadgan was saying, how there isn't a collective identity anymore, and how there's hundreds of billions of dollars which are not accounted for. We actually don't have exact estimates of the amount of money that was kind of unaccounted for and involved in corruption money, precisely because there is no Ministry of Accountability or Transparency in Iraq that would follow this cash trail. So to answer your question specifically, we would have to go back to the Constitution that was written after 2003, specifically under the auspices of Paul Bremer. Kurdish elites and specific elites from the Dawa party. So this specific coalition of provisional authority, the CPA, it one, neoliberalized the economy of Iraq, which led The Economist in 2004 to actually say that the constitution that was written after 2003 was a capitalist dream, right? There were 100 orders that were delivered by Paul Bremer, who was actually called the Viceroy of Iraq, or the Emissar of Iraq. And part of these 100 orders, I'm just going to name a few which I think are important for our discussion. Order 37, 38, 39, and 40. These four orders specifically sold over 200 state-owned companies. It dismantled the Iraqi bureaucratic state, so you no longer had ministries. You no longer had an army. The only ministry that survived was the oil ministry, as we all know, and we're all familiar as to why that ministry survived. You had, for thousands of years, Iraq was known to be a society that actually planted seeds. So it was a producer of agriculture. After 2003, that act was no longer allowed. So you pretty much had Iraq become a consumer rather than a producer of agricultural goods. You had the decrease of corporate taxes from 45% before 2003 to a decrease to around 10%. So oil companies, specific factories, specific factories were either didn't have to pay tax, so none of the money that they were making had to actually be pumped back into the state economy. So what you pretty much had was a wholesale of the Iraqi economic institution and infrastructure after 2003, which led to billions of dollars being unaccounted for. And believe it or not, there were some corporations, specific oil companies, that actually kept 100% of the profits, right? So they actually didn't give anything back to the Iraqi people. And that goes back to what Dr. Azadgan was saying, where there is no nation, right? All you have are specific groups which relied back on their either tribal identities or their religious ethnic identities. So whether Sunnis, Shias, or Christian identities because they didn't see a national tent or a national identity anymore. So that's somewhat kind of the quick answer for this. It's the problem of all of what's happening in Iraq right now is precisely the Constitution, right? The Constitution is very elastic. The Constitution itself is precisely, if you want to see it this way, a neoliberal sectarian constitution.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Al-Kassimi. Dr. Azadgan, you previously mentioned somehow the role of Saudi Arabia in this crisis. But if you want to go into details, do you think what the reason would be behind the intentions of Saudis and Emirates to somehow intervene in this protest and even make it violent? Do you think they would benefit from the violence in Iraq if this whole crisis and protest would go in a violent way or not?
That's a great question. Nobody ultimately would benefit from violence in the region. This is the root of the problem. Countries are fighting each other's battles in another country, and in many cases these countries where the battles are being fought at are neighboring countries, and the violence is going to spill over to the countries that are engaged in proxy wars. This is very, very important, and it's very sad. We have the case of Syria, where everybody was fighting their battles there, and the country is brought down to, the infrastructure is gone. The social fabric of the country is entangled, completely come apart. So we have to keep that in mind. When it comes to Saudi Arabia and UAE and some of the other GCC allies, they're absolutely petrified of Iran and Iraq becoming close to each other. Let's not forget that it was Saudi Arabia and Kuwait at that time in the 1980s who were the biggest financier of the Iran-Iraq war. They wanted these two countries to neutralize each other, to destroy each other. Iraq has the number 5 proven, it has the number 5 proven oil reserves after Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Canada, and Iran. This is huge. They are the number 4 exporter of oil in the world. This is a very, very rich country, very diverse, like I said, very young population. And yes, the sectarianism is an angle. 64% of the Iraqis are Shias. The next country after Iran and Iraq that has the highest population of Shia is Bahrain at 63%. So these things are important. In my assessment, the country shouldn't be identified based on its different sects. Iraq should be Iraq, whether it's Christian or Sunni or Shia or Kurd or Yazidi. First and foremost, we should focus on reinvigorating the Iraqi identity. And then, of course, being one of the most multicultural countries in the world, it has always had, different, religious sects or ethnic groups and what have you. The Saudis, they are not living in reality. They want to go back to days where they could control Iraq vis-a-vis sectarianism. You have some Iraqis who would argue that Iran wants to do the same thing. We have to be fair and balanced, that Iran wants to operate based on sectarianism. So there is grievance on both sides, but what the Saudis are trying to achieve is they're so unrealistic in their mindset that they do not realize that Iran has always been a power in the Middle East, is always going to be a power in the Middle East, a regional power and what have you. Saudi Arabia is not even 100 years old. They were put together by the British in 1932. Iran, on the other hand, has been around for 7,000 years. Iraq is the cradle of civilization. The Iraqi civilization, the Babylonian civilization, is even older than that of Iran. So to be so arrogant and hegemonic to think these two countries shouldn't play a role in the region, I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and UAE, is beyond ridiculous. It's just mindless. And this is the root of all problems in the region, the lack of acknowledgement. Your foreign minister, Dr. Zarif, has always said on record, and I'm not a fan of him, but he has always said, and we have to give him credit, that They're under no illusion, the Iranians are under no illusion that Saudi Arabia should not play a leadership role in this region. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Egypt are the four superpowers in this region, and they should all acknowledge each other's existence. But, you know, you have a regime in Riyadh, the Al Saud oil dictatorship, which is so drunk, you know, with the support they're getting from President Trump, that they think they can do anything and get away with it, and they have, you know, with murdering and dismemberment of journalists and what have you. So they are petrified. That the quick answer to your question, Ali, is that they are petrified of Iran having access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, and this is not just for the benefit of Iran. Is actually a confederation between Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, each of them playing their role. It's not like Iran is wanting to gobble up and you know, exert influence on everybody. That's not true at all. This is the lie of the Saudis and those in Washington who want to make a, you know, bad, you know, scarecrow out of Iran in order to create sectarianism and division within these four countries, which we call the axis of resistance. Now, if you add Yemen to this axis of resistance, you nearly will have the ancient map of the Sasanian Empire, Sasanian dynasty of the Persian Empire. I don't want to focus on Persian Empire. This is not about Persian Empire. This is about an axis of resistance made up of four countries, equal members, against a Saudi dictatorship, which is out of control. And also, let's not forget Israel. These two are coming together now, and soon it will be public. The relationship has been very strong behind the curtain, but it's going to be public. The Saudis are even saying this; they're going to publicize this. So they're playing a very destructive role in the region. And Saudi Arabia is under the illusion that they can make Iraq a vassal state. Nothing could be further from the truth. Regardless of the sectarian issues in Iraq, the Iraqi people will stand up to Saudi Arabia because they've seen what a corrosive role that country has played in its soil in supporting Daesh, and also in Syria in supporting al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda 2.0, which is ISIS. And they're not going to forget those days when their neighbor came to their aid, Iran, when Daesh was only 30 miles outside of Baghdad.
Thank you, Dr. Azadgan. So, Mr. Al-Kassimi, I would like to go into the next question, which is basically about the reason behind the possible interventions or supports that USA would have or had in this crisis in Iraq. I would like to know if there would be any special or specific benefit for that for USA, and if so, what would be the the possible interventions, or in some other words, supports that USA would have to different aspects in this crisis. So, what is your explanation about this subject?
You see, that's an interesting question, because for some reason, and this is also happening in Arab media, they're inaccurately stating, is the United States intervening? The United States has been in Iraq explicitly since 2003. It has the biggest base in the biggest embassy in the world. It's actually bigger than the Vatican, which employs over 20,000 either American private military contractors, which used to be called Blackwater, and now Academy, and now more recently XE. But it also employs U.S. employees, which is known as the Green Zone. The United States has been in Iraq, more specifically, as I said, since 2003. And as I said, the constitution that they put in place, the Bremer Constitution, which Iran and the Kurds agreed upon, which is why Ibrahim al-Jafari from the Dawa party was the first prime minister of Iraq, followed by Noor al-Maliki from also the Dawa party, right? They all agreed on this constitution, which further created Iraq and transformed it into a clientelist, comprador, petty bourgeois society, right? Where specific classes, their interest is more important and more valorized than the interest of the whole, which goes back to Dr. Azadgan's point. When you have a clientelist society and a clientelist comprador bourgeois class, they don't care about a national identity, right? All they care about is to advance their own private interests. So to say that is the US intervening, I think we're missing the point, and we're not being historically accurate. The United States has been in Iraq physically for over 16 years, right? Now, is this should we obviously be fighting imperialism? 100%. The United States is the bastion of imperialism, right? But the issue is that it's not simply the United States that's intervening in Iraq, right? The UAE, Saudi Arabia, for sure, right? The Kurds under the Barzani clan and other specific individuals, but also for us to be historically accurate, Iranian proxies such as the Dawa Party, right? One of the individuals like Adil Abdul Mahdi, who was the prime minister, and he recently resigned. He was the vice president of Iraq from 2005 until 2011, right? He was one of the main individuals who permitted and accepted the Bremer Constitution, right? These are very important historical facts that unfortunately people forget, intentionally or not. But we're here, and that's why we're having this conversation. The reason why people don't want Adil Abdul Mahdi is precisely because he's one of these corrupt individuals that allowed the division of Iraq, right? Religiously, politically, economically, whatever a person wants to define it as. The point is, Adil Abdul Mahdi is one of these individuals which further cloistered and created sectarian cleavages with the acceptance of Iran, and most importantly, with the acceptance of the United States. So that fertile space, that contaminated fertile space that's been created in Iraq since 2003 needs to be ripped out of its roots, right? And the only way we can do that is by creating and rewriting a new constitution that, as Mr. Azadgan said, prioritizes that prioritizes.
Right, thank you. Well, as both of you know, it's obvious that some part of these whole protests were against Iran. And, there has been some slogans against, Iran's government. And also recently, there has been some attacks on, embassies of Iran and different, properties belonging to Iran in different cities of Iraq. I would like to know if, first of all, if Iran is being a serious, problematic issue in Iraq, or if not, what is the reason behind all these problems or all these protests against Iran? So what is your explanation about this, Dr. Azadgan?
That's another excellent question. As Khaled was saying, again, both me and Khaled were concentrating on economic issues. The economic issues of many countries in the region, especially Iran, Iraq, and Lebanon, are the Achilles heels for these countries, whereby regional and extra-regional powers are intervening and using that opportunity, hijacking people's legitimate concerns and turning them into a regime change opportunity. So we have ample evidence of foreigners intervening. I saw a video, it's even on YouTube, for crying out loud, a video of somebody going around during the protests in Iraq and just handing out cash to motorcycle drivers and also small taxis, handing them cash and saying, this is for your gas money and this and that, encouraging people otherwise to make money by staying in the streets and having their legitimate economic concerns being taken hostage by these anarchists. That was a situation in Iraq. We saw evidence of that. I have many people who leak information about what's happening in Iraq to me, and the same thing we have been seeing in the past couple of weeks or so in Iran. If these countries don't have these Achilles heels, then the regional and extra-regional hegemonists won't have the opportunity to interfere like they are interfering. The neocons have this theory of creative destruction. That's what I call it, creative destruction of the Middle East. And they are being very successful at it. Physically, they have creatively destructed Syria. Iraq, of course, is another issue. Iraq put itself together more or less after all the destruction following the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq. But the case of northern Iraq, and I will always call it northern Iraq, there should never be an Iraqi Kurdistan. Never, ever. It's northern Iraq, just happens to have a Kurdish majority. The fact that this part of Iraq is more or less a country by itself, it's called an autonomous zone, but if you go there, if you travel there, the Kurds make sure their flag is as large as possible and that it's flown as many places as possible. Even though the president of Iraq, the first president of Iraq after Saddam Hussein fall was Iraqi, was Kurdish, excuse me. So this federalization of Iraq was a model, and Joe Biden, who's a presidential nominee or a candidate, I'm sorry, not a nominee, a candidate here in the United States, was openly talking and endorsing the Balkanization of Iraq. This is what they have in mind, from Lebanon all the way down to Iran. They want to balkanize. They want to create a new map. They are students of Bernard Lewis, who recently passed away, Princeton University. He came up with the latter years of the Ottoman Empire was not really reinforced. There was a free flow of pilgrims from one country going to another. There are many thousands of intermarriages between Iranians and Iraqis. I have so many friends who, 67 years ago, their parents were either Iranian or Iraqi. They married. And there is this incredible historical tie, and the Iran-Iraq war was the greatest tragedy when it came to this historical tie. Ayatollah Sistani, of course, is of Iranian heritage. The recently passed Ayatollah Shahrudi, who was, I believe, at some point the head of the Iranian judiciary, was born in Iraq. So, the Brotherhood was strong until the war started. They started the war until Saddam Hussein was goaded by Westerners and Soviet Union to start the war in 1980. And that's what they're trying to take away. They are masters, the neocons are masters at fostering sectarianism. They are doing that right now in Iran, just so you know, your audience would know. In the Iranian Azerbaijan province, there's pan-Turkic movements that are encouraged by Erdogan and his ultra-nationalists, expanding from Iranian Azerbaijan all the way down to Western China with the Uyghurs. So they're trying to take this sectarianism breakup and divisive strategies They haven't just implemented it in Iraq and Syria. They're trying to push it in Iran as well. The Iran's southeast province of Sistan Baluchistan is predominantly Sunni. It is one of the most economically deprived provinces of Iran, and the Saudis and Emiratis has vast presence there. Vast presence. We have intelligence information reports that they're handing out $100 bills to people. Very economically deprived, socially and economically deprived people. So in my assessment, if those countries take care of their internal issues and do not suffer from these weaknesses, then the regional and extra-regional powers won't be able to exploit it as well as they do. The economy is the Achilles heel of the four countries, currently the four countries of the axis of resistance: Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. And they will use that to create division between Iran and Iraq. With social media, lies are spread much faster, as is the truth. Both of it just filter. They go much faster, and sad to say, in many of these countries, I was talking to one of my colleagues at the University of Tehran, and I said, why aren't students in Iran taught critical thinking? Why are they not taught objective academic mentality? Because they spread rumors, and rumors become reality, and that creates perception, and false perception creates false reality. And this is what we've been seeing in all these protests in these three countries I mentioned. So we have to be very cognizant of that, because the actual reality may be very different than the projected reality that Washington and our allies are trying to implement in Iran and Iraq. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there's sectarianism. Yes, we need to reinforce a national Iraqi identity. These problems are there, but they are exploited by Westerners, I have to say, and their proxy nations, their client states like Saudi Arabia and UAE, and then this could go into a very, very dangerous place. In a few hours, I have an interview to talk about the possible presence of Iranian missiles in the Iraqi territory. Who knows if this is true or not? But if you monitor the U.S. media, they are filling the media about with all these anti-Iran stories. Forbes magazine just came up with a story that Iranian hackers penetrated into several U.S. companies. I mean, they're injecting these stories, and then they come up with the missile story, and then they talk about the fact that we need to send 14,000 troops to the Middle East. They are preparing for war in the Persian Gulf. The Israelis are talking about being there. The Chinese and the Russians want to be there. Wherever you have a concentration of superpowers, in addition to terrorist nations like Israel, in an area which Iran considers a sphere of influence, I'm talking about Persian Gulf, then you could have a potential accident which could cause a really, really bad condition. And the fog of war, the uncertainty of war will kick in, and then it'll be very hard to stop. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Okay, thank you. Here we have come to the last question, which is basically the final solution for this whole crisis. So I would like to ask Mr. Al-Kassimi about this point. So Khaled, what do you think the final solution would be for Iraq?
Well, yesterday, I think yesterday or the day before, because of the time difference, there was a special UN envoy headed by Janine Hennis that visited Iraq. Unfortunately, from direct sources that I'm willing to mention the name of the party, but I can mention the name of the person off the air. The party specifically is the Arab Coalition, Tilaf al-Arabi, and they were critical of the U.S. envoy, the UN envoy by Janine, because the solution that she provided, which kind of summarizes what Iraq has been living for the past 16 years, she gave three names, okay? She said, now that Adel Abdul Mahdi resigned, there's three names that we think as United Nations, right? Who, by the way, we all know that the United Nations was bypassed in 2003 to intervene in Iraq. Two, we know that there are politicians in Iraq that have for the past 16 years been bribed by UN officials to provide inaccurate and false testimonies about the situation in Iraq. The UN has been actually calling Iraq a democratic state for decades now, right? So it's kind of interesting to see that dichotomy happening, right? So going back to our main point, the US envoy, Janine, gave three names. These names are Noor al-Dulaymi, Yasser al-Yassiri, and Ibrahim Bahr al-Ulum. These are three individuals. Yasser al-Yassir is the former prime minister's really close friend of Adel Abdul Mahdi, right? So he's part of the deep state, okay? Noor al-Dulaymi, he's from the Dulaymi tribe. For those who are familiar with Iraqi history, they would know that the Dulaymi tribe is one of the biggest tribes in Iraq. Al-Jaburi being the first one, which includes over 10 million ethnic Arabs. And Ibrahim Bahr al-Ulum is close to Majlis al-Shura al-Islami, which in other words is the ISCI, which is obviously a representative of Najaf, right? So what did the Arab coalition say concerning that solution? Okay, she's the solution given by Janine. They said that it seems that the United States still perceives Iraq, right, as its own protectorate, as its own colony, where it could send UN envoys to tell the people what they think is better for Iraqis, which is, you know, par excellence, an Orientalist way, a benevolent humanitarian discourse, right, that is usually espoused by imperial powers. We know what's best for you, and all you need to do is agree to what we have to say. So that's one of the solutions that's being given in the circles of power headed by the United States through the United Nations. What we do know, and this is, I guess, my own opinion that I'm about to say right now, I think the former prime minister of Iraq before Adel Abdul Mahdi, which is Al-Ubaidi, right? He was part of the Dawa party at some point, but he actually left the Dawa party, right? And he actually initiated a new party in 2012, called the Victory Alliance, the Nasr Alliance. And the reason why he clashed with the Fatah Alliance is because the Fatah Alliance has been specifically pushing a religious narrative of its party affiliations, right? So it's highly, it prioritizes Shia theology to actually inform the party in general. It's highly driven by Ayatollah Sistani. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that if we want to create a national identity of Iraq, right, we can't make parties be abiding to religious doctrines. That's going to create more sectarianism, especially since a lot of Iraqis see the Dawa party, which took power after 2003, they see it as a proxy, which is why a lot of the slogans in Iraq, right, are saying Iraq hurra hurra, Iran barra barra, right? That's the slogan that's being said. Now, does that mean all of the people saying that are funded and paid by the United States? Absolutely not, right? There are Muslims from both sects who have been killed in Iraq. There's over 1.5 million people who died in Iraq since 2003. That's not a small number, and it's not simply because the United States intervened, right? There are specific problems in Iraq. So the solution, personally, is for us to create an alliance between Muqtada al-Sadr and al-Ubaidi, right? Because these two individuals, regardless of their religion, they're individuals who actually prioritize the well-being of the Iraqis with an S, right? Other parties like the Dawa party, it doesn't seem like it's prioritized the national identity of Iraq, since it's been taking orders from Iran, but also agreed on the constitution, which is a colonial constitution, right? when you sell off your resources and people within your country agree to that, they're traitors, right? And these people either need to be in jail or need to be exiled outside of the country, right? So the solution is precisely that, right? We need a national reconciliation meeting where people who were involved in exploiting the resources of Iraq, and as Dr. Azadgan said, over $500 billion are unaccounted for. That money didn't just go to London and Washington. That money either went into Swiss banks, right, or into specific bank accounts that are for Iraqis, right? So unfortunately, people are just focusing on, we need a new government, we need a better life. People need to respect the human rights, but it's like, okay, but we need to create a new constitution. We need to reconciliate amongst ourselves first, then we can move on, right? And my last point, which I know you said, the point on why are people blaming Iran, right? Well, Qasem Soleimani just landed in Baghdad yesterday, according to my sources, right? With 100 advisors, right? I respect Qasem Soleimani, but the thing is, a lot of people don't see it. Okay, it's like, why is one of the most important generals in Iran in Iraq, right? They might make these links where it's like, okay, isn't Iraq its own sovereign nation? So it's interesting to consider all of that. As Dr. Azadgan was saying, we need to be critical, right? So it's just very important to question what we're being told and not. By the way, as Dr. Azadgan was saying, this whole propaganda that there were 2 rockets that were going to be headed to Baghdad and bomb the square is absolutely false, right? That's propaganda to make it seem like Iran wants to create this like bloodbath in Iraq, right? That's obviously not true. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't specific.
Khaled,
Sorry, go ahead.
the West is accusing Iran of putting rockets there to attack the Americans. We have to be clear. They're not putting rockets there. They're not putting intermediary ballistic missiles to do anything against the Iraqi positions. The West is accusing, in my opinion, falsely accusing Iran of putting rockets there to attack the American positions in the Persian Gulf.
How Iranian proxies are putting rockets to bomb the Baghdad capital, which is obviously propaganda because Al-Arabiya is pretty much an ally of US imperialism. So I'm just saying, to legitimize what you're saying, which I fully agree with, that we need to be weary of not believing everything that we're hearing on the news, right? Iran is not going to bomb Iraqis with rockets, right? Like that will, like Iran has more to lose if they were to do that than actual gain, right? So that was just pretty much my kind of solution to the problem, but also not to sound too pessimistic. I do hope, as Iraq is the cradle of civilization, right? Or one of the cradles of civilizations, and for it to, reach a point where it can't even come up with how to deal and govern its people is really sad, right? People used to come to Iraq to learn how to develop laws back in the day, right? And now people are running away from Iraq because it can't even govern itself, right? So.
Okay. Thank you so very much for both of you. It was indeed a fruitful discussion, and I would like to put an end to this program and to this episode of The Fact, and hopefully we will have you again on this program on next episodes. I would like to thank you both again, Dr. Azadgan and also Mr. Al-Kassimi, for accepting our invitation and giving us your precious time and your precious explanations and also analysis. Thank you again, and hope to see you again. Goodbye.
Take care.
Thanks for having me.